What if I told you there was a game coming out in May that combines the storytelling and accessibility of the God of War games with the satisfying combat and rewarding challenge of the Dark Souls games? You'd believe me, I expect, because why would I lie about this sort of thing? But would you be excited about it? Let me explain, and you can decide for yourself. You're never... The game is called Blades of Fire. You might want to write that down because it's the sort of name that certainly slips clean off my brain like butter sliding on a non-stick pan. But it's going to be worth the effort of remembering, because this could well turn out to be a true hidden gem in 2025.
You stand in the forge of the gods.
What am I doing here?
You are now the bearer of a sacred hammer.
Blades of Fire is an original game from Spanish development studio Mercury Steam, which I'd go as far as to describe as the best developer you've never heard of. It's the team behind the two Castlevania Lords of Shadow games and also Metroid Dread, all of which are genuinely brilliant games. For some reason though, Mercury Steam has never received the widespread fame and acclaim it deserves. It's like the John Turturro of video game developers. Blades of Fire is likely to appeal to Souls fans. Structurally, it owes an obvious debt to Dark Souls, taking place in a relatively open fantasy world with multiple different routes to explore at any given time. When you die, you respawn at a rest spot, in this case an anvil, where you regain your health charges, but the penalty is that the majority of normal enemies respawn. So far, so Soulsborne. Where things diverge from the Souls formula is in what you lose when you die. Instead of losing something abstract like a bundle of souls, you lose whichever weapon you were using when you snuffed it. If you were wielding your beloved hammer, the Monster Smasher 9000, when the monsters decided that it was time for them to do the smashing, you won't have it when you commute back to the scene of the battle. The good news is that unlike dropped souls in Dark Souls, these weapons don't disappear if you happen to die again along the way. You just drop another weapon. The only way you could get into serious trouble is if you drop every single one of your weapons, forge some more, drop those, and then run out of crafting materials. Perhaps at that point, it's time to admit that Souls-like games aren't for you and maybe play something else? Dropping your weapon is still going to be a pain though, because in Blades of Fire, weapon selection is hugely important. When you lock onto an enemy, they'll briefly be highlighted either green, amber or red to show you whether your currently held weapon is more effective, less effective or not effective at all against this enemy type. Some are more susceptible to slashes from a sword, for example, whereas others can only be damaged with a bludgeoning hammer. Switching up your weapons as necessary is key. Judging from the opening couple of hours I played, character upgrades are streamlined so that almost all of the RPG progression choices you make are tied to the weapons you hold. You actually forge the weapons yourself from blueprints, selecting components, using materials you've gathered either from downed enemies or out in the world, and even hammering the steel into shape yourself. The quality of your blacksmithing earns you a number of stars, which determines how many times a weapon can be repaired before you need to recycle it and forge a new one. Mercifully, if you set a new high score for number of repair stars earned, you can then apply that every time you make a new weapon of that sort, so you don't spend 90% of the game doing the actual job of a medieval peasant blacksmith. Anyone who follows this channel closely knows I'm usually a big hater of weapon durability. I find it uniquely annoying, but from what I played of Blades of Fire, the constant flow of new weapon crafting materials, the ability to recycle some of the components of a broken weapon, and the fact that the focus of the RPG elements is predominantly in this one area meant I didn't descend into a frothing rage every time a sword stopped working. Combat itself functions slightly differently from Souls games. For a start, all the face buttons are given over to directional attacks, and holding the button produces a stronger variant of those attacks. It's a bit like For Honor in terms of strategy, but instead of having to choose a direction ahead of time and then press an attack button, you just hit the relevant button and the attack comes out. There isn't anything like a canned backstabbing animation in Blades of Fire, but if you get the drop on a low-level enemy and land a strong attack with a hammer, for example, their head will pop like a grape in a microwave.
If we don't, they'll slit ours. What?
The other point of contrast is that while raising a shield in Dark Souls made stamina recover more slowly, here assuming a defensive stance actually actively charges your stamina back up, giving combat a marginally different rhythm. It is still about timing your strikes, dodge rolling enemy attacks, and avoiding getting greedy as you hack away at a boss. It plays intuitively, the moves feel weighty and crunching, and the technical nature of the combat means you get that same magical sense of satisfaction from beating a boss as you do in Dark Souls.
It's finally fallen!
Something tells me it won't be the last.
It's like a warm bath for your ego. As for the game's resemblance to God of War, a few elements invite comparison to Sony Santa Monica's masterclass take on fantasy hacking and slashing. The overall aesthetic is quite similar to my eye. The environments I saw were lush, detailed countryside of a comparable quality to God of War's, and like Kratos, who puts the cross in CrossFit, the main character in Blades of Fire is ludicrously swole, with biceps as big as your head. Turns out there are pretty good gains to be had from swinging a giant hammer around. Another reason Blades of Fire put me in mind of God of War was the storytelling. Rather than the narrative style of Dark Souls, where the bulk of the story is delivered via cryptically written loading screen tooltips, this game has proper cutscenes and characterization.
Kid, time to go. We can't do anything. Now. Come on.
What's more, just like in God of War, you're being followed around by a slightly irritating young lad, in this case Adso, who helps out by cataloguing enemies and their weaknesses to help you perform more effectively in combat.
Tell me, kid, what can you do that might prove useful on this adventure?
I can read and write in ancient Forger. I can observe and draw. I know history and science.
All right, I get the idea.
The difference is, unlike with Atreus, if you find Adso's chatter is beginning to grind your gears, Blades of Fire has a dedicated button to send him away to camp so he can pester you no more.
Finished my first entry from this journey. I hope my observations on the Queen's dogs are useful to you.
It's right on the D-pad. You're welcome. Finally, much like God of War, Blades of Fire is designed to be an accessible game that a mainstream audience could reasonably enjoy. The recommended difficulty level, named Steel, is described as demanding and rewarding, and from playing on that difficulty for my 2 hours with the game, I reckon it strikes an excellent balance between handing your butt to you every so often to remind you of your place, but not being so brutally difficult that you want to stop playing entirely. There are, however, also 2 other easier difficulty levels below that, Iron and Bronze, if you're not up for the full Souls-like challenge and just want to cruise through the game, enjoying the story and cracking skulls.
This is your last breath, hero.
Though let me tell you, a cracked skull is so much more satisfying when you know you worked hard to crack it. As for my final thoughts on the first 2 hours of the game, well, I came away extremely impressed. Much like Jedi Fallen Order did, Blades of Fire takes inspiration from the brilliant mechanics of the Souls series, but wraps it up in a more accessible and less intimidating package. Fewer poncho options though, if that's a deal breaker. To my eye, Blades of Fire also looks really pretty. The game is powered by Mercury Steam's own in-house engine, but the level of detail, the lighting and the art design drew me in and made me want to keep pressing on to the next anvil to unlock more of the game world. Most of all though, the combat, wielding the weapons that are so important to the game's progression system, is very satisfying. There's a real weight to every single swing of the sword or a hammer, giving it a physicality that's missing from many a hack and slasher. It wasn't too difficult to adapt my Dark Souls muscle memory to Blades of Fire's control scheme, and it didn't fully break my brain like For Honor's ridiculously arcane system did. There's a real sense of ownership over each weapon as you carefully select components to suit your requirements and your preferred style, hammer the metal into shape, and even name it yourself. Unfortunately, with all weapons having an ultimately limited number of repairs before they break permanently, you're also going to have to get used to saying farewell to loyal and trusted armaments. Good night, Monster Smasher 9000. You can finally rest now. The elephant in the room is that this game is launching on the 22nd of May, just before Elden Ring Night Rain lands on the 30th, which will justifiably demand the attention of Soulsborne fans. While I reckon Night Rain will be a ton of fun, it's very much a multiplayer-focused experience, so although the two games share mechanical similarities, the Elden Ring spin-off is going to scratch a very different itch to solo RPG Blades of Fire.
I would have died if you hadn't showed up.
Yes. I was too late.
What are your thoughts on Blades of Fire? Are you as intrigued as us, or not sold on this Souls-like? Let us know in the comments what you think, share this video with a Souls fan who might have missed it, and also let us know if you'd like to see more of this game on Outside Xbox. See you next time!